Welcome to Orensha PowerShell series. In this lesson, we're going to go over formatting. And first, let's look at the default formatting for PowerShell. And this is what happens at the end of the pipeline. Whether it's into a table or a file, these are the default rules that PowerShell has to take your objects, format them into human readable text, and then put them somewhere. So let's look at an example of this using git process. We'll filter on PowerShell, and we can see here that these property names aren't the true property names in the object. They've been formatted into something that helps us understand the data, but it's not what is inside of the object. And we can see this by piping git process into git member. So we can see npm, pm, ws, these all have been slightly changed to represent something a little bit different from what is inside of the object. And the way that PowerShell does this is through formatting files. So let's go ahead and look at one of those formatting files. So within our PowerShell 7 modules PS readline folder, there is a psreadline.format.ps1 XML file. And this holds some formatting instructions that are used to format objects when they reach the host. And if we go down here, we can see there is a table control right here. And then scrolling down, we can see that it starts to define table columns. And so these are the instructions used, again, to take an object and give it default formatting instructions. Now, be sure to not make any changes to this file. It is signed, so if you do, it won't run anymore. So just make sure you don't save before exiting out of this file. Now we can also look at the formatting instructions using a command, which is get format data. And we'll run an example of that now. So we ran get format data on our system.diagnostics.process objects in our PowerShell version 7.1. We can see it gives us the format view definition. So this is just another way to see the format data in not so technical of a view. So what exactly happens at the end of the pipeline when we get ready to pipe our objects into either formatting instructions or some other command that puts it into the host or file? Well, when we run git process, we have process objects in the pipeline, and there's an invisible command at the end called out default. And this tells the pipeline to give it the default formatting instructions, and then that is piped to out host to put that data into the host. So if we run git process pwsh, it's going to give us our PowerShell process. But if we also run git process pwsh, pipe that into out default, and pipe it into out host, it's the exact same thing. So you don't ever need to specify these. That is what is happening under the hood every time if you don't specify something different. Now, if for some reason you did pipe a command with objects to outhost without any formatting instructions, outhost is smart enough to take the objects and pipe it to some formatting instructions, which will then be piped back to outhost to display the text in a human readable format. So let's look at what happens when there is no default formatting instructions. And we're going to use a URI object as an example. So we created a URI object using this technique here called casting, which is brackets with our object type here before our string variable, which converts it to that URI object. And here it created a bunch of properties for this string to make it into that full-fledged URI object. And you can see it is usually going to grab all of the properties that it can and display them in this list format. So the real lesson here with default formatting is that you can't trust it to give you the true names of the properties of an object. You're going to need to use something like getMember to get the property names to then use later on in the pipeline for filtering or changing objects in any way. So let's look at formatting tables, which is one of our formatting options. And that uses a command called format table. So let's run the help on that. We can see some of the parameters are property, which is going to accept an array here, which we can tell by these brackets. So we can specify many properties. And with property here, we can use wildcards. So we could always use just a singular wildcard to collect all of the properties, or we could put C in our wildcard to grab all of the properties that begin with C. So a lot of versatility there to use with that parameter. The next one to look at is this group by. And this really is only useful when we sort the objects first. But we can sort the objects and then use our group by to split the objects into two distinct tables. And let's look at an example of this. So we used get service and grabbed any service that starts with N and then sorted the objects using sort object on status. And then we pipe that into the format table, which the alias for format table is FT. Again, very nice to have when you're using the shell, but if you ever write scripts, make sure you're putting the full command name, especially easy when you have tab completion. And then moving on here, we're specifying the property parameter and grabbing display name and then grouping by status. So here we can see status stopped, status running, and then it gives us the display name of all of the services in each group that start with N. So that is a very good parameter to be aware of when you're using the format table command. And the last parameter that we're going to look at here for format table is wrap. And we'll look at an example to demonstrate exactly what wrap does. So if we take get service here and pipe it into format table, we're going to see a bunch of these that have these ellipses at the end, the three dots, and that is cutting off the data because there's too much to show here. But if we use wrap, it's going to show us all that data by wrapping the text to the next row. So we can see here, it gave us all of the text by wrapping it around at the outer limit of our table. Next, let's move on to formatting lists. And the command for that is format list. And it includes many of the same parameters as format table. So you're going to be able to carry on what I just showed you for format table into format list. And this is another great tool to use to get all of the property names besides using getMember. And we'll look at an example to show you this. So we have getProcess filtering on PowerShell piped into format list and then specifying all of our properties. So we can come in here and see exactly what the property name is to then use in our scripts or to use in the pipeline later on. So another great alternative to use besides getMember. Next, let's move on and look at formatting wide lists. And the command there is format wide. And the key difference here for format wide is that it's only going to show you one property. And the default is usually going to be the name property. But we can use that property parameter to specify the property that we want to see. And we'll show you an example of that now. So we took our get service and piped it into format wide. You can see here we have the names of our services given to us in a wide list. So something to be aware of in case you ever find it useful to use that command. Next, we're going to look at customizing the column and list fields in our data at the end of formatting. And one great way to do this is using hash tables. And this is a tool that we can use to rename a property or change a property or do mathematical conversions such as switching from megabytes to gigabytes or changing even from Celsius to Fahrenheit. Any of these kinds of ideas you can do using a hash table. And the basic structure of a hash table is going to be an @ symbol at the beginning of some curly brackets, and then you're going to have a name field with whatever you want to be the name of that hash entry. And then you use a semicolon and you have an expression to grab what you want to be calculated for that name. And that usually is going to be using the $ underscore dot whatever property name we have to grab that specific property name. But again, we could always multiply that by 1000 to give us a different representation of what that data is. And let's look at this using an actual command. So we are going to take our get local user command and pipe that into format table with our property parameter. And again, we have our @ symbol in front of some curly brackets with our name equals first name to give a name to this expression. Again, you can see here this is taking another set of curly brackets and using the $ underscore dot name that gives us the name property of these objects, but changes it to show first name. So if we hit enter, we can see it doesn't say name up here like it would in the default formatting. It says first name because that's what we changed using the hash table. Next, let's look at outputting beyond the shell. And the main way that we're going to do that is outputting to a file. So best think about this. We have our objects in the pipeline. We pipe that to some formatting instructions to make it human readable. And then usually it's outputted to outhost, but we can also output that to out file. And that's just going to put it into a flat text file to use later on. This is a great technique to use for logs or anything like that. Another command that we can use is out grid view. And the key to out grid view is to understand that this command does not accept formatting instructions. It accepts objects, but it's going to display those objects in a nice GUI for you to use. So let's look at an example of that. Take our get process command and pipe that into out grid view, and it pops up here a nice GUI interface of all of our process objects. Again, you can see though, it's still got that default formatting that was in those files. So there is a nuance there to consider, that it's still going to get formatting if the formatting is in those formatting files that we looked at the beginning of this video. And the last thing that we're going to cover in this video is where we should put our formatting. Now, formatting should be the second to last thing that we do in the pipeline, with the last thing being either that out host or out file, putting the human readable text somewhere. But formatting should always occur after we're done manipulating all the objects in the pipeline. And one way to look at this, if we took our get process and then pipe that into format table, and then we pipe this into sort object, this isn't going to work because in the pipeline, after we run this format table, there's a different kind of object in the pipeline. So then taking it and running sort object, we don't have our process objects in the pipeline anymore. We have this other kind of object that is more of a formatting object. So just remember, we always want to take our formatting and put it all the way to the right, only being followed by a command like outhost or outfile. And another thing to remember, certain commands are not going to accept formatting instructions. One of those being that out grid view, another being export CSV or convert to HTML or even convert to JSON. None of these are going to take the formatting because they're taking raw objects. And then one other thing to always be aware of, you always want only one type of object in the pipeline at all times. And the reason there is because PowerShell is going to take the first object in that pipeline to use as a archetype for the formatting for all of the rest of the objects. So if you have get process, semicolon, get service, this is going to place two different kinds of objects in the pipeline, but it's going to use the get process object as the archetype for the formatting. So it's going to get really funky once those service objects enter afterwards, and it's not going to look right as far as the formatting. Now, there are ways to make this work, but this is more of an advanced topic and not something really we should worry about as we're just getting introduced to PowerShell. And that wraps up the lesson on formatting. Be sure to watch out for my next video, which is going to go over filtering and everything that we can do to narrow down the scope of the objects that we're getting in PowerShell before we start doing all this cool stuff like formatting. So be sure to check that out. Thanks for watching and have a good day.